So given that we're talking about comics and sequential art, I wanted to show you some of the books that I've had published in the small comics, but also the hidden stuff that is where the skill comes from in order for, at least for myself, in order to be able to do this kind of work. And that is mostly a focus on traditional drawing and painting, specifically drawing in sketchbooks and filling them up with observational drawing. Comic artists, when I was in art school, comics was a no-no. It's a big no-no. They wouldn't talk about it. They wouldn't discuss it. They wouldn't entertain it in any way, shape, or form. You were going to be an artist. You were going to be an illustrator. In comics, you were the redheaded stepchild of illustration, which was funny because illustration was the redheaded stepchild of art. So we're really the redheaded stepchild of the redheaded stepchild. But what they would concede, some of the instructors that I had, was that comic artists could draw anything. They were drawers, big time. And so, and I tell that to my students all the time, drawing is basically the fundamental, the basics of all of this stuff. And if you don't like drawing, probably not the place for you to do comics, because it requires nothing but drawing, constant drawing. So my first graphic novel was Enemy Ace, War Idol. And it was a project that I started on my own, stemming kind of an outgrowth from my first illustration work, which was working for one of those mercenary magazines. And I was illustrating a lot of stories for Vietnam veterans. But the more I did of that, the more I wanted to actually kind of say something of my own about war in particular. I grew up in the 60s, my childhood, all the way up till about I was 15. This war was going on that scared the hell out of me. It petrified me. And thinking I would have to go. And it wasn't unreasonable to think that I would have to go. I can remember signing up for the draft and all that stuff. But so I started researching more and more about that particular war because I wanted to know more about it and trying to understand this thing that had horrified me so. And the more I worked with those non-vets, again, the more I wanted to do something of my own. So I remembered this comic book I read as a kid called Enemy Ace. It was by Joe Kubert and Robert Kanigher. And that became sort of a nice counterpoint to the Vietnam War material. And that comic book specifically was the very first American comic to show the enemy's point of view. And it was groundbreaking at the time in the 60s during that war. My character that I was working on and the stuff that I was, focused on was the Vietnam War. So I made my character a tunnel rat in Vietnam. I thought, what a great counterpoint that here's this character that is basically the Red Baron, and he's in the sky. He's considered the killing machine, but he's in the sky in a machine shooting down other machines. He had a certain distance from the war. He was still intellectually knew that he was killing people, but there was a distance there because they were in machines. And yet my character was in the tunnels in Vietnam having to do serious close-up killing. So he goes to this sort of place where it's like a sanitarium for the older Enemy Ace, and he poses as a reporter to talk to him and try and figure out for himself how is it that this old man who's considered the killing machine, able to live with the things that he had to see and do when he was in World War I. And so that's what this whole story is about. This just two men trying to come to grips with the things that they saw and had to do as soldiers. So I wanted to write sort of an anti-war book, but not an anti-soldier book. It's not a slamming of soldiers at all. It's more about, we ask these people to go do these horrible things in our names, and yet when they come back, they struggle so horribly with how to fit back into normal life. So that was what I was sort of getting at. And I did this entire book in watercolor because at the time I was really, that seemed to be the best way. I saw this book, this character, I saw this whole scenario as a very real thing. So to me, I wanted to get as close to reality in a way that I could. So it wasn't comic book characters in my head. It was like a tackling of this reality. Other books that I've done, like the Wolverine series and the Batman series, those they're not real to me, you know. So those I wanted to have a different take on them and a more graphic, sensibility because they're not real to me. Um, anyway, this book saw something like I forget 12 foreign editions. It went into 3 or 4 American editions. It was on the required reading list at West Point Military Academy. Um, but it was my first graphic novel, and it was like this amazing chore. It was a 128-page graphic novel full of art. It took me 3 years to do the art on this. And so, and it was, and I was always a comic book fan, wanted to be a comic book artist, and had apprenticed with Marshall Rogers, who was one of my heroes, one of my gods, who drew Batman when I was a kid. And I went to a signing in New York City where he was signing comics, and I hit him up to see if he'd ever thought of having an apprentice. And he was like, "Yeah, I've thought about that. Are you interested in that?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So he said, "Yeah, well, I was in art school. I was a freshman, I think." He said, "Well, bring your work in to Continuity Associates, which was Neil Adams' studio, and let me look at it, and we'll go from there." I'm like, "All right." So I took it up there and showed it to him, and he was like, "Yeah, you got the job." Blown away. So I was doing all this grunt labor for Marshall, which was, he was working on Doctor Strange, and he was working on the Coyote for Eclipse Comics. So I was like, my job was to do all the grunt stuff. So I would, he would say, "Oh, put a chain link fence over here. I need a certain type of car here," and I would run over to, in the back to Neil Adams, the studio's big morgue file, dig up the reference, and I would have to project it and draw it out. And he had me inking the backgrounds and putting the zipatone and all that stuff on there. And that cured me of wanting to be a regular comic book artist. So, and by that time too, I'd already also been totally blown away by Jeff Jones's paintings. And so I really wanted to become a painter also. So I was having these divergent sort of, directions that I wanted to go. When I was a kid, I read comic books religiously. I mean, I was a junkie, I had 2 open heart surgeries when I was like the first one, heard another bang. My first open heart surgery when I was like 5, well, when I was 1. The second one was 5 years old, and that was 1965, and that's when the Batman TV series was on TV. And I was hooked on this thing. I didn't know how to tell time, but I knew this inner clock was like, you got to turn the TV on. It's time for Batman. And my family saw how totally engrossed I was in this TV show. They started buying me comic books, the Batman comic books. I was hooked. So I always wanted to be a comic book artist as a kid. And I learned how to draw from copying those drawings on the covers and in the interiors from all my heroes. And by heroes, I mean artist heroes. I love the characters, but there was a point of demarcation where all of a sudden it was still about the characters. I loved all the characters. I loved the stories, but it was about those artists became like my best friends, and that work blew my mind. I wanted to figure out how to do that, to have that kind of power, to have that kind of power for people, to show them, make them feel those things, right? Which I was feeling. They were moving me constantly emotionally. So my entire, compass was set to comic books for years and years and years, and all through high school, junior high and high school, elementary school, all that. And then when I got to art school, I had these divergent things because I did that apprenticeship with Marshall Rogers, which kind of cured me of wanting to do regular comic books. Marshall saw comics as entertainment, which is great because they're incredibly entertaining. But I, at this point, I connected with Jeffrey Jones and the studio gang. So there was Jeff Jones, Bernie Wrightson, Barry Windsor Smith, and Michael Kaluta. And they were changing the face of comic books at that time. And on top of that, they were also doing things that had nothing to do with comic books. They were doing posters and prints and illustrating books. And that was like this eye opener of this wider world of art. I grew up with art. With my parents were into art, so I had art books around the house. I mean, I was a Rembrandt junkie. I remember saving up lawnmower money for the big giant Abrams Norman Rockwell book. And my uncle was an artist, was a pastel artist and an oil painter. And he was always like, well, look at this Rembrandt. I'm like, yeah, Rembrandt's great, but he's no Jack Kirby. So, and it wasn't until I got, swayed by Jeffrey Jones and the Studio Gang where all of a sudden they became the door that opened up to a wider world of art for me. And coupled with that apprenticeship, all of a sudden it was like, okay, I want to be able to do everything. So my scope changed dramatically, but the skill set to get to any of these places I wanted to go to was still the same, which was traditional drawing and painting skills. And in order to really get that down, luckily I had Baron Story as an instructor my junior year in art school. Actually, my sophomore year in art school, because I only did 3 years of art school. But we knew who Baron was. We knew his work, and we were like freaking out. But you had to be. We didn't know you had to be a junior to take his class. But Kent Williams and I signed up, not knowing, and we got into the class, and we were doing everything. And I remember Baron pulling us out and going, "You guys aren't supposed to be in my class. You're sophomores. You're supposed to be juniors in here." And we're like, "Oh." He said, "Well, look, if you don't tell anyone, I won't tell anyone." And he let us stick it out. So, but Baron was instrumental in getting all of us turned on to sketchbooks, journaling, what he called journaling. And that has been like one of my, it's one of the saving graces of getting my skill set up, my drawing and painting ability, drawing ability specifically, was observational drawing. So I couldn't have done any of this stuff that I'll show you without that under my belt. And it's what I do now. It's an everyday thing. But this gives you an idea of I was doing full on watercolors and some colored ink like this blue ink here. This is back in the day. This is like, I started on this again. Like I said, I started this on my own. I was not hired by DC to do this. It became a pet project of mine, like this toy I kept playing with, my little gizmo. And at that time, Jay Muth had started, he was working on his comic book Moonshadow from Epic Comics, and he kept hitting me up to come up and help him finish it. When he got behind on deadlines, "Hey, you want to come up and help me work on this thing? We have to do an entire issue over the weekend, fully painted comic book." And I was like, "Yeah, okay." He goes, "It's all penciled. It's great. We're good to go." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, I'm on." So he would buy me a train ticket. I was in Brooklyn. He was in upstate New York. So I would take the train up. Jay would pick me up. I can draw up to a certain point out of my head, but then I shoot reference to draw from. But Jay was like, "Hey, it's all penciled. It's great. We're going to just like knock out so, and I get up there, and this was Jay's idea of penciling. It was like, here's a panel. And he had this, right? With an arrow, it said Moonshadow. And I was like, "What? That's your pencils? Oh my God, I'm in trouble." But Jay used a lot of reference, but he could do beautiful work out of his head. But we did have enough reference to make this work, and so we would bust out an entire 23-page comic book, fully painted in watercolor over the weekend, and that's what I was like, "Wow, okay, I can do this." I think I can definitely do a longer thing. The longest project I had ever done before that was what amounts to my senior project in art school, which I was never a senior, I was a junior. It was an 8-page comic strip that I did for that project to turn in, and ended up getting it published in Heavy Metal. But that was the longest thing I'd ever done, an 8-page comic book. Everything else was like half-pagers that I would do for Heavy Metal. But this gave me, working on Moonshadow gave me the confidence to feel like I could do it on my own, like do a serious painted book. So I started messing with this idea, but it was sort of, I was writing about it, and I kept 2 sketchbooks that I kept specifically for this project, which was, I never drew the characters. I just drew World War One. I wanted to teach myself that time period. So I was drawing from old books of photographs from that time period. That series of work really pushed my drawing ability a lot further before I even started doing really finished work for the series, because I was doing so much drawing for myself, which is always, for me anyway, the most enjoyable. But like I wanted to understand for myself like how those clothes fit, these heavy bulky wool that they were wearing, and the helmets, so I just drew and drew and drew. I filled up these two sketchbooks, and that's what my buddy Scott Hampton would drive up from Columbia, South Carolina. I'd get a phone call. Hey man, what are you up to? Nothing. I'm on my way. Click. 8 hours later, Scott's knocking on my door, and I would throw my keys down. I'm in a Brooklyn walk up, and but this time he called and said, hey, I'm going to go to Rick Bryant's studio in Midtown. Why don't you bring all that NMEA stuff? And literally, I've been working on this stuff, just playing around, for like 3 or 4 years. I've been playing with this idea. And he said, bring all that ACE stuff. I'm going to scope it out. I was like, okay. So I took everything, the sketchbooks and whatever loose bits I had with me, which I do have scans of. And I get to Rick's place, which was like this he had a small little place, he had a Murphy bed, But Scott's like, oh man, is this all the ACE stuff? And I'm like, yeah, and he goes, oh great. And he picked it up and he walked out of the apartment. I'm like, what are you doing? He goes, I'm going to DC Comics with this stuff. If you want to be there when it lands, follow me. So he just left. I'm like, he's got my stuff. So I followed him. He walks into DC Comics and goes to the receptionist. Hey, I need to see Andy Helfer. We walk in the back. There's Andy Helfer, and he goes, Andy, check this out. Don't you want to publish this? And Andy's like, yeah, we want this. And I was like, all of a sudden, fear. It's like all of a sudden it's real. It's not just for me anymore. And that was a scary thing. But it gets into that area that Norman Rockwell always talked about, is like, can you do this? Even if you can't, you say yes, and then you figure out how to do it. So I was thrown into the deep end, and this is what came out of it. The art took 3 years. The writing went much quicker. I had an idea. I knew my story. I didn't have dialogue, although maybe in a couple places I might have had some dialogue. But it was a very free-form way of working, because I knew the emotional roller coaster I wanted the story to have, the beats, and I knew the scenes, that I wanted in there. And so I did all the art and then wrote dialogue and stuff to fit it after the fact. So I don't work that way anymore. But this book was an incredible learning experience for me. And it touches on something that I think that is important about in this discussion about working sequentially in comics and stuff. And it's what you hear writers say all the time to aspiring writers. You want to be a writer, you better have read a lot. If you don't have time to read, you don't have time to be a writer. And I believe that's very exact same thing that can be said for anybody that wants to work in this business, is like having read a lot of comic books and sequential art, you will understand so much more and so much more powerfully the power of it and how to actually execute a lot of it if you've read a ton of it. So you can't read enough, and also be, eclectic in your reading tastes. Don't just stick with one thing like superhero books. Try everything, because do you want to limit yourself to that kind of story, that one sort of little fantasy, or do you want to be what I feel is a richer, more diverse, powerful creator? You want to be able to tackle any subject that you find interesting, and the way through that is having read a lot of those stories. I mean, you hear writers say, "Oh, I wrote that book because I couldn't find that book to read." And there's an aspect of that. Like this was for me, yeah, it's like, I wish there was something I could sink my teeth into as a reader, but I couldn't find it. So I wrote it, and at the time, my buddies and I were sort of changing the face of comics with the painted material. That was a fairly new thing. So you really want to have be a diverse reader. You want to, have a solid reading knowledge of the material, the different types of comics that are out there. There's memoir. I mean, the beauty of comics is it can handle anything. It can be memoirs, it can be adventure, it can, any genre, it can be nonfiction, it can be anything. And so you definitely want to play to your strengths, and it will challenge you no matter what your abilities are. And yeah, we were, and going back to this idea that we were sort of changing the face of it through painted comics. We were coming from an entirely different background than a lot of comic book artists from our art education and being into not just drawing, but these painters, the impressionists, the fauves, everything. We were wallowing in this world of art, and we wanted to do it all. So that's Enemy Ace, War Idol, and you can see even through the novel itself as you go through it, my own personal growth as an artist. You can see my skills getting better and better and better throughout this book. But so much of that comes from the sketchbook, the observational work. And, those two sketchbooks that I kept for Enemy Ace, Kevin Eastman, who created the Ninja Turtles, was one of the creators. Started a publishing company when those things hit so big, and he hit me up to publish those two sketchbooks, which we did, called No Man's Land. And it was at a time when my drawing ability was, it was sort of on the edge. I was learning in leaps and bounds. And it was, like I said, through those drawings that I began to better understand the idea of shape, especially working with shape rather than details. Like, oh, I'm not drawing an eye, I'm drawing these shapes. And that was a real wake-up call for me. And it was all self-directed and self-motivated.